All right, assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome back to the Muslim Mental Health Podcast, brought to you by Paras Taqwa. We're back for episode 10. Can't believe it's already been 10 episodes, but we're back.
Yeah, mashallah.
Today we have Saima and Sumaiyah back on. Alhamdulillah, we're glad to have Sumaiyah on as back-to-back. It's been a while since we had back-to-back.
Yes, that is fair.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about the anxious mind. And before we get started, Aleena, you want to jump into some quick disclaimers before we talk about anxiety today?
Yeah, of course. So we are going to be talking about, like Qasim preface, anxiety, and we will be talking about some symptoms and like certain like scenarios. And we did want to mention that although we are bringing these scenarios up, that everyone's experiences are so personal and different that we'd want you guys, if you have any concerns, personal concerns, to reach out to a professional one-on-one to be able to, address your own personal concerns. We truly just want to like open doors and like not open doors, but try to like normalize this topic to bring to the community. And so we want to pose this like topic and question to you both, Saima and Sumaiyah, about, anxiety as a spectrum, like the concept of anxiety. What is anxiety and how you guys would define it in your professional lens?
Yeah, no, I think that is a great question. Thank you guys for prefacing the topic, because I know when you say like the term anxiety, everyone's probably thinking of a different scenario in their mind. We may have certain personal experiences with it. We may think it's something a lot bigger than it actually is, which is why we want to bring up this idea of spectrum, right? So clinically speaking, yes, there are anxiety disorders in the DSM that if somebody comes in and they qualify as having an anxiety disorder, we will diagnose them. And that can look like generalized anxiety disorder, that can be social anxiety disorder, that can be panic disorder, so on and so forth. But what we want to focus on here with inside the anxious mind is that anxiety is essentially an emotion, right? I am feeling anxious is very different than believing that I am an anxious person, because then then it becomes a label, which it necessarily doesn't always have to be a label. And that's where we want to bring that awareness to that particular point today is all of us have felt anxious at some point in our lives. Right now, we're experiencing a very anxious time. That's why, I guess, a part of the spectrum, one side of the spectrum is anxiety is an emotion that I feel maybe on a day-to-day basis, that I feel when something externally happens and makes me feel anxious. It's an emotion that maybe comes up for me when my inner critic is speaking to me in a certain way. So that's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum, I would say, is the more debilitating anxiety that will hinder a person's ability to function on a day-to-day basis, to the point where I'm getting up in the morning and I can't actually physically get myself to get ready for work, or I'm not able to sleep all night. Nighttime anxiety is like, I don't want to say at an all-time high, but very high right now. And I'm so anxious that I'm feeling nauseous and I'm not able to eat. So these are all ways that a person's daily activities are being hindered, and that is more debilitating, where it's affecting their body, their mind, their relationships. That is what I would say is on this side of the spectrum, where maybe those diagnoses will come in.
For sure. Before I kind of let you guys get going with this, obviously today we're not going to really talk about self-diagnosing in a sense, but just for the curious mind, just to touch on it, somebody, if you want to hop on it, what are some qualifications or what are some signs where somebody can look into, like, hey, I do have debilitating anxiety, like this should be something I should be looking more in depth into?
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that a clear way that I think about it is when you're experiencing a general loss of functioning, that would be a way to indicate that you might need to seek some sort of professional help or treatment. So loss of functioning in your daily life can be, as Saima mentioned, maybe you're not able to get out of bed. Maybe you're not able to leave the house because your anxiety feels too unmanageable for you to be able to go to work, for example, for you to be able to hang out with friends. Your relationships are starting to suffer a little bit just because of the way that you feel and the way that you're not able to go about your daily activities in your daily life. So that's not to say that if you are not experiencing a whole loss of functioning, that you can't also benefit from therapy, because I think that that's also important to note. But if you're looking at, do I have this anxiety disorder or do I not? If you are experiencing a loss of functioning in your ability to go to work and your ability to get out of the house, your relationships are suffering, then that might be something that could indicate that you might have an anxiety disorder. But if you don't experience those things and you're still feeling like you'd like to talk to someone, you want more support because you're experiencing, again, the end of the spectrum of anxiety or somewhere in the middle, then you can still benefit from therapy, even if you might not have like a generalized anxiety disorder.
So what we wanted to kind of delve into just throughout this episode, more so than defining between like debilitating and like the everyday anxieties, just more or less what the anxious mind is and how people are living with it. Like the reason why we wanted to talk about this topic is because anxiety can manifest in so many different ways. Like it's different for everybody. We talked about earlier when we were meeting to record the episode, like just talking about anxiety, my legs were shaking, this or that. And I just realized in the moment of like, just talking about anxiety, it has different manifestations for different people. So if you guys want to talk about that a little bit, the manifestations of it and how, whichever side of the spectrum, so to speak, you're on, the manifestations are kind of similar.
Yeah, and they are. I think that for me, in my experience working with clients, what I've seen the most is people talking about this feeling of like their chest tightening a lot when they're feeling anxious. That one I feel like concerns people a lot, because it's like, am I having a heart attack, or like what's going on? I had a client who, was seeking medical help because she thought that she was having a heart attack, and they would keep sending her back home because they're like, you're not having a heart attack. We think that it might be anxiety. And it's like a very, very uncomfortable physical sensation when you are experiencing anxiety. I know that's one of the bigger ones. I mean, the one that Qasim described, your body shaking or feeling a little bit jittery, your palms sweating. I don't know if this can be considered a physical manifestation of it, but obviously like the racing thoughts, the having trouble sleeping, changes in your appetite. I mean, those are some of the bigger ones. I know even like your voice shaking, it just feels like you're a little bit, you have like a loss of control, which is what anxiety is essentially. And so when your body feels like you're not in control of it, that like then signals to your mind that no, you are not in control. You can't control the fact that your hands are shaking, that your body temperature is going up, that your heart rate is going up. And that can also feel very destabilizing. So those are some of the bigger physical manifestations I've seen.
Yeah. I think those are honestly really, really common ones for anyone who is feeling anxious. But I guess some others that are coming to my mind are like feeling nauseous, feeling having kind of like digestive issues is something that I have seen, and not even just professionally, but just people in my life. Headaches. Muscle tension is a huge one. And this one I want to talk a little bit more about, because stress and anxiety can really go like one induces the other. When we're feeling anxious, we can get stressed out. When our body's stressed out, we can get anxious. And our bodies respond to stress. Like stress is literally the bane of our existence, honestly. So muscle tension, like when your body is storing all of that stress and anxiety, you can get muscle tension, you can get headaches, you might feel sore, you might have body pain. So these are dizziness is another one, digestive issues, like I had mentioned. So some of these things can really, physical things that we may think are maybe associated to our health, like a health condition, may just be health anxiety, where it's actually like a mental thing rather than like a physical diagnosis. Like Sumaiyah was saying, like someone may feel like they're having a heart attack. Someone may feel like, is there something wrong like neurologically because I keep getting these migraines? But maybe I'm just so stressed out that I'm holding all of that in my body and I keep getting these migraines.
And is there any way to catch yourself? Like if someone, in the mind of someone who's going through this, like the reactions in this way with their anxiety, is there any way to catch yourself or like think it through? Because like everyone goes through, like not everyone who has like, for instance, like the stomach problems as a result of anxiety, someone can have that, and whereas another person can just get clammy hands. Like because everyone's manifestations are so different, how can we catch that and how can we work through that?
I mean, I think it's about I love telling clients, like, learn how to tune into your body, because you'll notice patterns coming up, especially in certain situations where you might be able to get keyed into the fact that you're feeling uncomfortable, anxious, whatever it is. So like I had a client one time and we were talking about her upcoming travel plans, and she was like, I'm going to be so stressed out. I'm going to be so anxious, you know, with the kids, all those things. And I was asking her, what do you notice, you know, typically occurs when you're feeling stressed out, anxious? And immediately she was like, my jaw just like locks up and I start like grinding my teeth. And I was like, okay, so noticing that that is something that your body does as a response to the stress is important, so you could observe maybe like a little bit beforehand, before it gets to a point where you feel out of control, that, oh my God, my jaw is locking up. Oh my God, I'm grinding my teeth, or I'm tapping my foot, or I'm doing whatever other thing that we do with our bodies when we start to feel stressful, so that you can observe the emotion before it kind of takes you over, and then you feel like you're completely out of control.
I really like that you brought up the mind-body connection, because again, when we're feeling anxious and when our baseline is anxiety, essentially, right? A lot of times people disconnect from their body.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm feeling tense, but I don't really know what it feels like to not be tense. Right? So if someone doesn't know what it feels like to be relaxed, then how will they even know that they're anxious or it's induced by anxiety? You know, so that mind-body connection, to be in tuned and connected to your body, is kind of that first step, like checking in with yourself. And I think another thing is, I would say, like specifically that I see within our community, is that we normalize a lot of health issues. Like, it's just okay to get a headache every week kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or it's
High BP is very normal.
yeah, exactly.
Drink more water.
Exactly. Where it's just like, you know, maybe if this is happening over and over again, you don't even have to start off with seeing a therapist, honestly, because if you come to me telling me you're having these physical symptoms, I'm probably going to send you to your PCP first. Be like, get everything checked out first. And if everything is fine, then, hey, maybe this is stress and anxiety related. So let's start unpacking some stuff.
For sure. And I really appreciate that comment of, it's not a popular thing to say. It's just like, I'm going to send you to your PCP first, because that's a common experience people might have with a therapist of like, hey, I'm dealing with this. But and I know, just as in my personal experiences, I tend to not get the physical manifestations of it. My thing is more of my cognitive patterns. So like I was telling you guys a little bit earlier when we were meeting about this, like when I'm hanging out with my friends, just randomly I'll just catch myself. Like in my brain, I could feel myself catch myself. I'm like, yo, I'm not in the right spot. Just mentally, just something's a little bit off. And then like I'll have my own process of like just thinking things through and like, okay, just trying to get myself back to normal. I'm back engaged with the conversation. I know like in a social setting, like for example, like you'd be picking at your food, you'd be, you know, like just engaging from the conversation, staring at your phone, checking your phone. So those might be some things that that might be a physical manifestation of anxiety when it's really up in your head. What, any thoughts, any insight of like the cognitive patterns and like catching yourself and how to check in with yourself in those moments, because it might not always be a physical, like my clams, my hands are clammy. Oh my God, I'm anxious. Whereas more of like you're just going about your day, and then all of a sudden it might click or it might not. So.
That's a good question.
Do you wanna? Yeah, I can take it. With that, I feel like the way that I would approach the thought patterns is through a lot of mindfulness. And mindfulness is basically the idea that we don't have control over the thoughts, the feelings, the memories that kind of pop into our mind, right? And sometimes those thoughts are anxious thoughts. And so when you're noticing that you're having these constant anxious thoughts, you know, what if this happens? You know, this is going wrong. I am like this, whatever those anxious thoughts are. And you start to ruminate on them, or you start to spend a lot of time focusing on those thoughts, it can turn into almost like a thought pattern. But with mindfulness, the whole purpose of it is to notice those thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, whatever it might be, as what they are, and not fixate on them, and then be able to return to whatever it is that you're doing, to be able to live presently in the present moment. So let's say that you are out and you're, with your friends, whatever it is, and you start to have these thoughts, you recognize, okay, my brain is giving me these thoughts that I cannot control, because we cannot control what pops into our mind. I'm recognizing them as thoughts, and I am making the intention to return to the present moment. I'm making the intention to recognize them as just thoughts, and that they're not going to then derail me from whatever activity or whatever I'm engaging in the present moment, because the fixating on it part is what can turn into, like, again, this feeling of, and now, it's like almost like a snowball effect, right? So again, it's just like a lot of present moment awareness and tuning into the idea that no matter what you do, you can't get rid of a thought. You can't, pushing it away only makes you focus on it more. But noticing that when they pop up, they're there for whatever reason, as annoying as they may be, and then saying, okay, it's there, but I'm not going to allow that to derail me from, being in the present moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask Qasim, did you mean, like, how do we shut off, like, a mind that's racing and then we're kind of fidgeting? Or more like, I know what the thought is and this thought is bothering me.
Yeah. So how to, like, address it? Because I feel like when you address something in your head, it becomes more like a roadblock.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're just staring at this big wall of, like, how am I going to get over this?
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, you might not have physical manifestations. We talked about a little bit earlier, where some of Sumaiyah's clients feeling like they were having a heart attack. And then some people thinking about a panic attack gives them a panic attack, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that can happen, right? But when it comes to, like, not the physical manifestations, but more of the cognitive manifestations of a wall and it's very abstract in that sense of how to address it without fear of addressing it, because that's kind of what it is like, I'm feeling this way, and addressing it is acknowledging that I'm feeling this way. So it's a little bit of that of a hurdle.
I see. So it's like, I'm feeling this way and I don't know what to do now.
Yeah, it's like there's no options left.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that I would firstly, acknowledge that as, like, a very internal trigger. Maybe like nothing has happened, like, because you said in your scenario, you're just kind of, maybe we're just sitting with friends and, like, kind of just, like, fidgeting with my phone, and there's a whole thing going on up here, right?
Yeah.
And then that internal trigger happens. Like, the inner critic is like, wait, by the way, you're X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh,
Yeah.
what?
Of course.
Like, what do I do with this? So I would say, like, if anybody finds themselves in a stuck position where there is a intrusive thought, as we call them, intrusive thought that's bothering them, and they're stuck, they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, you check the validity of that thought. What evidence do I have that I am this? Right? Like, for example, right? Something a lot of people struggle with, clients, non-clients, I struggle with this, we all struggle with this, is thoughts of maybe this thought that I'm not good enough in some scenario, in some capacity. So then if I'm checking the validity of the thought, I'm going to be like, okay, what evidence do I have that I'm not good enough?
Yeah.
Right now. And maybe your mind will come up with that evidence in that moment. Then we have to check the validity of that evidence. So, like, right now, it's like, I'm not good enough because, give me a reason why someone may not feel good enough.
Like in high school, like a sports team, somebody won an award or somebody did something great, and you're like, you feel like I'm better than them, but then that doubt creeps in. It's like, I'm not better, or like the validity of that, like.
Right.
Like in that certain scenario, or relationships, that's a thing of, like, I'm not good enough for this person or that.
Right.
So
comparisons, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes comparing ourselves with other people can trigger this thought of, I'm not good enough. And then it brings our self-esteem down, and then we start feeling more anxious.
Yeah.
So that thought pattern, actually, I would say after we check the validity of it, positive self-talk plays a really big role, where we know I am not good enough is an intrusive and unproductive thought. And instead we have to, and this is a journey, we have to work towards believing that I have value and self-worth regardless. Especially us, and this may come up with, not the four of us, I'm saying in general, as, humans, as believers, as Muslims, we have value, we have purpose regardless. We're here because we are good enough to fulfill this purpose that we're here for. So, and that's a journey, right? Because there's a reason why you're not feeling good enough. And once you identify those reasons, we contemplate, we self-reflect, then you make it to this healthy place where it's like, oh, I'm feeling like I'm not good enough right now. But regardless of this, I know that, I have value.
For sure.
I'm worthy.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very long-winded answer. I'm so sorry.
That was really
I loved
beautiful.
it.
And thank you so much, Qasim, for bringing up your own experience, for this scenario. And I just want to bring up my own experience because I thought it would be a great point to potentially talk about. But for me, when I felt the most anxious, or a portion of my life where I felt a lot of anxiousness, was honestly like post-grad. The sense of like unknown and uncertainty, and a lot of like a huge change in my life. Like I just got used to a routine of living off campus, and now I'm back home and I love it. But also for some reason, I still feel this big anxiousness of like an unknown. And I guess I just was wondering, like, this concept of like anxiety based off of change and how potentially to navigate it. Because someone could potentially not go through, I mean, it's very easy to say no one can go through anxiety. A lot of people go through. If anything, everyone goes through anxiety. But like having a mild form of anxiety for like a good chunk of your life, and then all of a sudden, like, it's like almost like a whiplash where it's like, whoa, a huge change happened, and I don't know how to navigate through this anxious change, like anxiousness because of this change. So would you guys be willing to talk about that kind of concept of like anxiousness due to change?
Yeah, definitely. I think something that immediately comes to my mind is like with transitions, there is an adjustment period, and it can feel so destabilizing when we're going through these life transitions, and we feel like there's a perfect way that we should be able to navigate these changes. Like we should just be like cool, calm, collected, nothing about the change should feel, different, or our ability to navigate these periods shouldn't feel stressful. But it is so common, and it's something that I've seen so many times where change happens, and that's actually what brings the person into therapy. It's because they're like, I don't know how to navigate this time. I don't know what to do. I don't know what the right thing is. I feel like I'm completely failing at this transition. But it is so, I mean, I hate to use the word normal, but it's so typical for us to have a reaction to different life transitions. And so I think something that I love to lead with is this idea of like self-compassion when you are struggling in whatever you're doing. And in this case, what you're talking about is a transition. I remember when I was going to grad school, so obviously I had taken a gap year. So again, it's like, I wasn't interacting with anyone, the social, aspect of my life had kind of gone down a little bit. And when I got to grad school, I was met with like the social anxiety that I had experienced when I was a child. And I was like, I thought that I was over this, I thought that this is not something that I had to struggle with anymore. And so that took me by surprise. And it also brought out a lot of like that inner critic where it's like, shouldn't I be able to handle this? Like, am I not, 23 at the time, just a lot of critical, self-doubt, those type of thoughts. And I think that, once I recognized that dealing with transitions or navigating transitions is something that can be stressful for a lot of people, it made me be able to give myself a little bit of grace and compassion to know that there is no perfect way to be able to handle transitions, but just being kind to yourself as you are figuring out what works for you is so important.
Yeah. I like that you brought up self-compassion, Sumaiyah, because wouldn't it be unnatural if you weren't nervous and anxious going through a big change?
Probably.
Yes.
Right? And I think this again goes back to this negative connotation that the term anxiety has, where it's this problem that needs to be solved. But essentially it's a human response, right? Like, I'm going through this big milestone in my life, starting grad school. What else is there? What other milestones? A new job, getting married, having a child, like, all of these big things, they're meant to be nerve-wracking. They're a part of a human experience that's going to be different, and there's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be times where we feel like we're not going to be able to do it. And that's okay, right? That's okay. Should we undermine what we're feeling? Absolutely not. But we also have to tell ourselves like, okay, this actually makes sense. Like, I'm nervous before my first day of school.
Yeah.
This makes sense. How can I deal with this anxiety? Who should I reach out to? What are some things I can do to ease it a little bit and push through it rather than like, I need to get rid of it?
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think for me, that was the concept of trying to just push through it, fake it till you make it. Because another portion of my anxiousness came from like going to college, like going to university for the first time and moving out. And it's so bad. I did not like the first few weeks at school at U of I. I was telling everyone I loved it. I was like, oh yeah, it's great, like blah, blah, blah. But in my head, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I feel so anxious, blah, blah, blah. So I kept telling myself, fake it till you make it, fake it till you make it. And like, eventually that just became true. Like the transition happened. I made it for myself. Like I made it. I'm okay. Like I'm stable. I'm grounded. I'm okay. And a lot of that had to go with like pushing through with it. And I think that like repetitive aspect of going through that again is what caused that anxiousness. So just again, like pushing through it. At least that's again my own experience. It can be different for everyone, but yeah, thank you for that.
For sure. And I think I really loved your example because obviously you kind of went through the same thing down at U of I. Even if as a freshman moving down there, like that was one thing, just like, yeah, I love it. Even though like you're looking forward to it. And that's another interesting point. Something you're looking forward to, then all of a sudden you don't like it. I know that's very specific. That might be specific to college, but other things in life too. Things just happen where
you look forward to something and it's not what you expected.
Exactly. And then the opposite can happen where you weren't looking forward to something and then something great happens out of it. I wanted to talk a little bit more about outcomes in just a second. We'll take a little bit of a break and we'll kind of talk about the balance of outcomes and how that can play in our mind. But yeah, we'll be back in just a second. All right, welcome back from the break, guys. So we kind of left off, or I kind of left off talking about how the next thing we want to talk about was outcomes. And what I meant by that was how anxiety kind of stems from this idea that this one outcome is going to happen and the certainty that this one bad thing is going to occur. And there's various situations in life where we could be sitting in a scenario and we're just so certain that this bad thing is going to happen without acknowledging like there's a plethora of outcomes that could happen. So Saima, if you want to talk about more of like how when we're in these kind of decisions or moments of like how can we scale ourselves back and acknowledge like, hey, like anything can happen here, not just this one thing that I'm just so fixated on.
Yeah, no, I think, again, when we are feeling anxious and those anxiety levels are a little bit higher, then the mind is naturally going to be attracted towards the worst possible outcome, right? The worst case scenario. And that's like that. What if this happens? What if that happens? Like, what if that bad thing happens? I need to protect myself. Essentially, it's our bodies and our mind telling us that, hey, be prepared. You need to protect yourself. But at what cost, right? Because protecting yourself is not necessarily a bad thing. But if the mind is racing and constantly telling you, what if this bad thing happens? And that's kind of, like you had mentioned, Sumaiyah, destabilizing you, then we need to take a step back. We need to, like, here's my anxious thought of, what if I fail that exam? What if, like, I'm going on a trip? What if there's turbulence? What if the plane crashes or something like that? Not to be dramatic, but these are the what if statements, right? I'm going to take a step back. Instead of being consumed by that thought, I'm going to take a step back and put that thought on one side right here, that, okay, what if this happens? I'm going to hold space for that thought. And then I have to give it I'd have to do the due diligence to bring about the other possible outcomes. Because what if the plane crashes is a hypothetical scenario, right? You have no evidence to show that the plane is going to crash. You have no evidence to show that you're going to fail this exam. So, but you are going to hold space for it because that is a possible outcome. It's the least desired outcome. Now, what is the most desired outcome? That I'm going to pass the exam. The most desired outcome is that I'm going to get to my destination safely. So if I'm going to hold 50% of the space for the least desired outcome, I have to do my job and hold equal amount of space for the most desired outcome. And when we do that, then we're looking at things objectively and you're able to bring those anxiety levels down, essentially. And that's how it's a way to train your brain, right? Because not everyone just knows how to think that way, right? Because as humans, we have this survival instinct, this very natural survival instinct that's going to be like, okay, what could go wrong so I can solve it beforehand? and then I'm in the clear. So that's how our brains naturally think. But we have to kind of reel ourselves back and be like, okay, that's a possibility, but what are the other possibilities? And until I have evidence to show that one of these is actually going to happen, I'm going to hold space for all of them. Instead of getting my mind and my body riled up for this just hypothetical scenario, this one hypothetical scenario that my mind is trying to convince me is the truth, when it's in reality, it's not.
Yeah, I feel like that goes back to the idea that we were talking about before about like fixating or rumination, where you decide that you're going to let this thought that pops into your mind, you're going to make that into your reality almost, right? Again, these things did not happen, they did not occur yet, but you kind of already have labeled it as reality, or it's a certainty that this bad outcome is going to happen. And then it's kind of, it's very difficult to detach yourself from that because you've already fixated on it. You're already ruminating about it for, a long time. And so it seems like there's really no other possibility. You haven't held any space for other outcomes. And I think that typically happens when you're leading with the anxious part of you, because we are just a sum of different parts, and when you make that anxious voice the loudest part of you, then it seems like there is nothing else. This is how it's going to be. The worst thing is going to happen because you're letting that anxious part of you be the loudest part of you. And then you're also allowing like that inner critic part of you to be very loud, because it's like, why are you so anxious about this? Why do you always have this kind of like black and white thinking, worst case scenario thinking? And so it just becomes a jumble of, again, racing thoughts, fixating on these thoughts, ruminating, and it feels like there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that, again, using some of those mindfulness techniques to recognize these thoughts as thoughts and not as reality can allow you to live a little bit more presently.
Yeah, and I like the way you said that, Sumaiyah, because we want to really reiterate that your mind telling you to protect itself and to protect your mind and your body is not a bad thing, right? That there's a reason why that instinct, that gut instinct, that natural fear is there. But to what extent do we want to allow that to consume us is the question we want to ask ourselves, right? Because no one's sitting here trying to be like, anxiety is bad and like, let's solve all of that and think in a completely different way. No, it's like, let's look at it in a holistic way. How can I make this productive for myself and still function?
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think that I don't know if Qasim, you mentioned this a little earlier, but sometimes when we have that sense of like anxiety, we have this feeling of like a problem solution situation where we feel like, okay, there's something wrong, I need to fix it, and it's almost like an immediate need, and like that contradicting like mindset where like you want to fix it, but like you have like physical reaction, your mind is like all disoriented, like all that like contradicting like each other. Like there might be the sense of like loss of control and just a lot of uncertainty. And I think for me, I don't know if we want to transition into like how to like cope with it or like how to get through it. But like when I had like a couple of months ago, for the first time, I had a moment of like a lot of anxiousness, like this feeling of anxiousness. And it got to the point where I had to like detach myself from like the situation, like what was happening, and like I had to go straight to the bathroom, and I got a piece of like paper towel, got cold water, and had to like take a few minutes, put it in the back of my neck, and just breathe. And I just had to like detach myself from like my present moment, like the present moment that was happening, to like ground myself. And so I wanted to bring the concept of like how to cope with it. If you're going through these anxious thoughts, these racing thoughts, and like all these contradicting feelings in the inside, like what are there any physical ways to like try to calm yourself? Was that a good idea, like, to like put a paper towel on the back of your neck to cool yourself down? Like kind of like that. How can we navigate through it as you're going through the process, like the anxiousness, like right now?
Yeah, I think getting out of your mind and into your body is one of my favorite concepts of therapy. Like, I love it so much. And I think what you did, Aleena, with using that, cold paper towel and putting it at the back of your neck is a great skill. Another one that I would recommend to people is, holding a cold ice cube. It's like shocking your body, allowing yourself to, because one thing that anxiety does is it increases your body temperature. It increases your blood pressure. And so holding onto a cold ice cube shocks your body, allows you to for 1 second or, for however long, get out of those racing thoughts in your mind, that those black and white thinkings, those thought patterns, and allows you to literally feel what's going on in your body. And in this case, you're holding onto a cold ice cube, splashing cold water on your face. When it was winter, one of my clients would always say, she would take a walk when it was like super cold and no one wanted to go outside. But for her, that was a way for her to get out of her mind and into her body. So that's something that I think is really helpful for people. I know for me, when I start to feel anxious, like I like to put my hand on like my pulse on my neck and just feeling it beat really fast. Like at first it's uncomfortable because it's like, oh my God, why is this happening to me? I'm nervous. Again, I start going into those like worst case scenario thinking, but then I start to focus on the fact that I can feel my pulse through my neck, and it just kind of brings me back into my body and allows me to focus on something else instead of all of the like negative thoughts that are going through my mind.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, Saima, if you wanted to jump in, but Aleena, a great example of detaching yourself from an anxious state of mind, an anxious scenario. But just in my own experiences, there's the experience where you detach yourself and then you have to reattach yourself back to the anxious experience or the anxious situation. Something might be going on and you have to go back and address it, or you have to be there. You're like, there's situations in life where that presents itself where it's like you can't just go out the back door. So any advice on like how to not only physically but kind of just mentally get back into a state where you can handle or not manage an anxious scenario that might be recurring, or might be something that you have to destabilize yourself, where you have to destabilize the situation and yourself. So how can you kind of navigate that balance? I know that's a little bit nuanced. It might be more scenario based, but I know that's like a common thing, especially in our cultures, like that, having those moments. Yeah.
I think sometimes, especially because you mentioned destabilizing a situation, sometimes depending on the situation, my mind went straight to like there's a problem at hand, and I'm also feeling anxious. So a lot of times, if you're a solution focused individual, like you play a certain role maybe within your family, and it's like I have to solve this problem and then I have to deal with my emotions later.
Yeah.
So if that is the type of scenario we're talking about, then most likely then you're going to go into problem solving mode and solve the issue. Make sure you're safe, make sure everyone else around you is safe. And then later on probably is going to come the emotional impact, the mental impact of whatever situation has occurred. And I think that's when we have to acknowledge how we've been impacted by it, a certain situation. Like I am feeling anxious or I am stressed out because of this. And now I also deserve to give myself the time and space to cope with it. And now coming to your question of how do we cope with it, right?
Yeah, like just kind of doing the tango of like, okay, I detached myself, maybe I'm okay now, but revisiting it and kind of going at it in a different way where you don't want to go back to an anxious state where you have to detach. Yeah. Or, I mean, detaching is not a bad thing, right? But more of like kind of just going about the situation.
Sometimes it doesn't go away.
Sometimes it just doesn't go away. Yeah.
And
it's
still there.
Yeah.
Yeah. You brought up the situation where you like, there are people that we know that have to deal with things at home, things at school, things at work, where they're the imperative piece to the puzzle. And they have to keep going back and back and back. And you mentioned it, how they tend to be problem solvers and they'll deal with it. And then the emotions can tend to be something that they address at a later time when they are a little more in a de-escalated state. But I know a little bit more of a nuanced question again, but
it's a tough scenario, right? Because it's like, it kind of goes back to what is in our control. Because if your environment is not in your control, you can't change your environment, then you have to learn how to navigate through your environment, right? You have to learn how to self-regulate, and then you have to want to change as well, right? Sometimes people want help, but like they don't know how to take those steps. Like it's hard for them to help themselves because they don't feel like they're worthy of, being helped by themselves or others. So that, and then that's a whole, self-esteem is a whole another issue. But when it comes to coping with feeling anxious on a day-to-day basis, when your environment is anxiety inducing, then we bring it to self-regulation, right? We have to figure out what works for us and what doesn't work for us. Self-acceptance and self-awareness is a huge part of it, where it's like, what are my triggers? How do I know when things will escalate inside of me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, when do I know I need to step out and remove myself from the situation? Kind of like what Aleena was saying earlier. That's a really great tool. It's like, I need to physically remove myself from this room and go outside and take a few deep breaths. Or I need to develop a routine on a day-to-day basis where I am doing some self-reflection, where I am journaling, where I am writing down my anxious thoughts. Or I need to have a support system. I need to figure out who my solid support system is, where I can talk about my feelings, where I can tell them that I am struggling. So there are many different ways a person can still navigate through their difficult environments, because when you look at their what do people call it? Locus of control, like what is within their control, is what's in your control essentially will be the way you react to a situation, the way you choose to take care of yourself, and if you choose to advocate for yourself. And this is particularly if we're talking about a difficult situation. Yeah. Let's say the situation is out of your control, then all the control lies within you.
100%. 100%.
I don't know if that answered your initial question.
Of course. I think what we're trying to get at is probably like a larger discussion for a whole different topic. In terms of just situations in general, of like specific scenarios that we might can cover. But again, I think that was great advice for. Yeah, Saima.
Yeah, I actually just thought about something while we were talking, because I remember that we were talking about it earlier. And it's kind of like this idea about accepting the fact that there will always be a part of us as human beings, because anxiety is an emotion, right? There's always going to be a part of us, big or small, that is a little bit anxious, right? And a lot of us feel shame about the fact that we are experiencing anxiety, whether it be because of like age, gender, religion, whatever it is. It's like, I shouldn't be feeling this way. This makes me feel weak. This makes me feel like I'm incapable of doing whatever it is I need to do. It's preventing me from living my life or whatever it is. And so we attach a lot of shame to this emotion, like we do with a lot of different emotions. But anxiety, it happens a lot that people feel like they should not be feeling this way. And so once we're able to accept, even though it's hard, it's a healing journey. But when we accept the fact that there's a part of us that's going to be a little bit anxious, it's not going to be able to navigate every single scenario perfectly, then you're able to understand that when it shows up, it's showing up for a reason. Sometimes it's showing up to protect you, to prepare you, whatever it is, and acknowledging, okay, that's my anxious part of me showing up. I'm not going to respond to it critically. I'm not going to respond to it with judgment and shame. I'm going to accept it, acknowledge it, and then again, kind of continue to live and do it, whatever it is that you're doing, instead of, again, fixating on this anxious part and then feeling shame and judgment about the fact that you're experiencing it.
Yeah, sometimes you really just kind of have to bring it down to the basics, right? Like, what can I do to take care of myself? I can control maybe not control, but I can work on my sleep. I can work on my eating habits. I can work on taking care of myself, like physically, like exercise and like movement, and I can work on my communication skills. Like, it really comes down, sometimes it really just comes down to the basics. What can I do? Let's not even get into, working towards changing your environment.
For sure. Aleena, anything to add?
No, I was just going to say that that's such a good point, like the back to the basics thing. Because I think that when we do have that, like when we're in that anxious state, we tend to, again, try to find a solution almost like immediately. And we don't realize that we're like jumping like 50 steps, and we don't like you said, Sumaiyah, like take a step back, or like Saima, you also mentioned that, like take a step back and just like go back to the basics and understand like what are we in control of, what are we capable of doing in your current moment, whether that's taking those deep breaths, whether that's detaching yourself, and eventually, like when you feel regulated, going back to that. Sometimes that like you're able to do it, sometimes you're not, but just going back to the basics. And I think I feel like that's such a really important aspect of, I don't know, like a good step to like the coping aspect of feeling anxious, for sure.
For sure. And I think, again, the great points in terms of going back to the basics. I feel like we're avoiding something, not avoiding, but we're leading into something that's, again, what our organization is. So this Muslim Mental Health Podcast, and when we're talking about our Muslim experiences, when we're talking about mental health, salah, dhikr, dua is most commonly brought up. Of you're not doing enough, so you're not feeling this way, or you feel this way because you're not doing this, or you're not praying enough, or XYZ. Those common, blanket statements that we hear so often. But what I want to talk about is more of like, yeah, there's more truth to there is truth in having your prayer. There's intentionality in there, just within our deen, it's intertwined there, where it is for the worship of Allah, but it's also for yourself too. And I think what we get caught up in sometimes is more like, we feel like if we do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to feel this way. And we kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier with XYZ actionable steps to solving XYZ problems. Not really kind of the way to address anxiety. There's different ways. You have to hold space for different thoughts and ideas and different circumstances. There's might be physical manifestations they have to consider. And a little bit more of the same with our deen in terms of what we're striving for. It's the intentionality behind it that provides its meaning rather than the action itself in its purest form. The action itself has goodness within it, but if you are coming at it in a angle where you expect something out of it, then what are you really putting into it if there's expectation attached to it? So I think that's a little bit of an interesting discussion to have when it comes to addressing our mental health. Do you guys have anything to add on to that in terms of like when we talk about salah and dhikr and how there's healing properties to this? There's studies about this, but how can we utilize it not as a tool, but but more of like a holistic approach?
Oh, go ahead, Aleena.
No, are you sure? I was just gonna say that, like, for me, the first thing I thought about is like the concept of, like, I keep talking about the concept of detaching yourself, but that's how I see it. Like, having the ability to pray 5 times a day, doing dhikr, like, you are like detaching yourself from like what's happening like in your day-to-day life and just focusing on that singular aspect of like prayer. And that just, I don't know, for me, it just shows the concept of like, I don't know, like seeing like prayer and dhikr and all that stuff as like the outlet, like it's just one thing, connecting you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's nothing else attached to it. So like the concept of like it just being its purest form, like all you're doing is getting closer to your Lord, and whatever is happening outside of it is happening. But like in that moment, that's just like in that moment, that's all that's happening. So that's just how I saw it as.
Yeah. No, I think, again, I like that you brought up the moment and the importance of acknowledging what's happening within that moment, whether it is the anxious thought, whether it is, something positive that's happening. Essentially, existing in the moment will help us, because what anxiety is doing, or what the concept of anxiety is about, the fear of the unknown, like we've been talking about, like what's going to happen, all of these what ifs. All of these what ifs that take over our mind, which have no end in sight, essentially. But as believers, as God conscious individuals, we are constantly taught to bring it back to what is, right? Not the what ifs. It's about what actually is in this present moment. And I think that's when, all of these forms of prayer, whether it's salah, whether it's dua, whether it's dhikr, whether it's learning about Islam, they all fall under the umbrella of taqwa, right? Of God consciousness. And they're all ways of connecting with Him so we can remember. And I guess as a more personal take for me is like, so I can remember in those anxious moments that ultimately He knows what's going to happen at the end. It's that this distinction between feelings and facts. And I do this a lot with my clients, Muslim and non-Muslim. It's like, okay, what are the feelings? Let's validate your feelings, because you have every right to feel this way, and this is an emotion that you're feeling, but it's temporary. This I'm feeling anxious is a temporary emotion. And the fact is, if it is a Muslim client, then the fact is that ultimately Allah knows what the outcome is. And for anyone else, it would be the fact of the matter is that you don't know what's going to happen at the end. And that's very important, because I do think we're living in a day and age where, as we're progressing towards mental health awareness and we're progressing towards, talking about emotions and emotional intelligence, all these concepts, which is great, but we do need to figure out that balance between validating emotions and feelings and also keeping in mind that certain things are actually black and white when it comes to the way we are supposed to think and believe about ourselves, that we are individuals with purpose. We are individuals that have worth and value.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to the idea of circles of control. And one of the bigger circles, things that are out of our control, is Allah's will and Allah's plan, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so being able to recognize, again, like you do what you're supposed to do, you tie your camel, and then you have to put your trust in Allah's plan and understand and really trust the fact that He is the best of planners. And I also think, like, even with dua istikhara, that is a prime example of being able to let go and say, if this thing is meant for me, if it's good for me, then let it, come to fruition. And if it's not, then replace it with something better. So it's the idea that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, He created us with anxiety as an emotion. I mean, that's why we have dua istikhara. It's like, it's so clear. And so it's not, again, to feel ashamed that you have it. It's not necessarily to say that your trust in Allah is weak, but it's just a reminder that although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with this emotion, there's a way to be able to navigate it in a way that is healthy and reminds you of your purpose and who is in control, and to recognize the fact that we don't have all of the power. We cannot control every single facet of life, and that we have to use dua to ask Allah to give us what we want and to guide us in times of need.
My God, you brought up such a beautiful concept, Sumaiyah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally instilled anxiety, this emotion, into us. Like, there's a reason why it's a concept, right? Whether it's as a form of protection, whether it's in the form of a test, tribulation, whatever it is, it was His will. SubhanAllah.
For
Beautiful.
sure. And then there's more of like, and you guys mentioned it earlier, I think Saima mentioned it, how there's an innate value to a person. That God-given innate value is something to give us comfort. That's just not something that we just say, or that's something in our deen that's just said just because we just say it, just because we want to, just because it is what it is. It's truth to it. And there's so many healing properties within having solace in Allah and having that firmness. Obviously, it is a work in progress. Nobody's saying that you need to have it immediately. Obviously, those are things that we've heard growing up of like, yo, you're not praying enough. Those things aren't true at all in terms of like where your mental health is at. You can be the most praying, most diligent believer possible and still have anxiety. That's just something that's built within us, that's wired within our brains. So that is something that we definitely need to hold space more as a community of like, look, the most pious of us have these problems, and people that are not practicing have these problems. Non-Muslims have these problems. So definitely something that has to be addressed head on. So, Saima.
Yeah, and honestly, I think this was a great discussion. I think we tried our best to keep the focus like on the anxious mind, whether really not taking either side of negative or positive or any of that, but really just what does it look like to feel anxious, how we can cope with it, like that kind of stuff. And everything we did talk about here, many of you may resonate with it, but many of you may not resonate with it. I think, of course, the more we talk about it as a community, the more you all talk about it with trusted individuals or self-reflect, take a moment to contemplate. There's nothing wrong with holding space for yourself as well. If you do feel like, there is something more there, if you feel like there is something that you would want to talk about with the professional, I highly encourage everyone and each and every individual to seek therapy if you feel like that would be beneficial to you. If not, then it's always good to seek out to your support system and talk about these things, because the more we talk about it, the more we'll understand why certain things are happening, how we can cope with them, and how we can move forward, like essentially as a community, because it's something that we can all relate to on a personal level. So, inshallah.
Sumaiyah, anything else?
I think in terms of just like the way that I conceptualize anxiety, or the way that I conceptualize it now, by recognizing it as something that all of us kind of carry with us, has allowed me to, again, distance myself from this idea of like it being a bad thing, it being a negative thing or a shameful thing. So I think that if you're experiencing anxiety at whatever level, being able to just be kind to yourself, being non-judgmental about the fact that you have this anxious part, again, seeking support, not feeling like this is something that you can just like overcome on your own. If that's not the case, I think that being able to just be honest and authentic and say that you need support to be able to navigate it, without the shame and the judgment. Again, that inner critic that makes the anxiety even louder is something that I really resonate with. And then just accepting the fact that this is a part of the way that we were created, and all of Allah's creation is perfect the way that we were. And so, again, some of us need a little bit more help, a little bit more support, and that's totally fine. It's about being compassionate with yourself, having grace with yourself, and seeking support when you can.
Thank you guys so much. I know for me, like I feel like I resonated a lot with all of your guys' perspectives. One specific was like the concept of like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating us this way. Like it always goes down to the basics, and that's just how we were created. Some people have a lot more anxiousness than others, and that's okay. It's nothing shameful or anything wrong. And I think that's something that I'm going to be taking with me post like this episode and podcast. So I really appreciate it, you guys.
Yeah, for sure. Jazakallah khair. I mean, a lot of what we experience as believers kind of boils down to the basics, and whether that's within our anxious mind or whether that's within our deen, attempting and trying with intentionality is one of the best problem-solving techniques that we can have. Whatever problem that we might have is operating with intentionality and taking care of ourselves within our physical manifestations, whether it's gripping onto a cold ice cube or whatever else it might be. There's outlets for all of us, and hopefully, inshallah, we can operate with intentionality and with purpose within that, and find solace and comfort within those intentionally driven actions, and not just actions for the sake of actions, just because we said it on a podcast. Who gave us mics, right? So inshallah, we can kind of take that away from the episode. But with that, we're just gonna wrap from there. Jazakallah khair for everybody watching. I have a feeling we're gonna do more similar topics and kind of deep dives into these denser topics. So inshallah, Jazakallah khair for Saima and Sumaiyah for coming out. Inshallah, we'll get to see you guys soon.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Salam, guys.
Thank you.